Next, for today's perspective, we want to look at the issue of whether war crimes have been committed by Israel in its military response to the Hamas atrocities. A senior UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has said atrocities have been committed by both Hamas and Israel. He said this, that Hamas militants on the 7th of October and the continued holding of hostages were heinous war crimes. He added, so were the collective punishment of civilians by Israel. Well, I want to bring in Rosa Freedman and look at the legality of war. She's Professor of International Law and Conflict at the University of Reading. She's on the phone. And first of all, I want to start off with a simple question, but many governments have different answers to this. I'd like your reflection on this, Rosa. As you see it, is Israel committing war crimes in Gaza?
From the information that's come out, and we have to be very careful that the information coming out, particularly from Hamas and from their health ministry that they run, is often propaganda. But the information that's come out that's been verified, it looks like Israel is committing a war, but not necessarily war crimes. We won't know until the end of the war. We never do, and we know that within all wars, atrocities occur. But the key difference between how Israel is behaving within this war and how Hamas is behaving is that Hamas has clearly been committing war crimes since the 7th of October, both against Israelis in Israel and then again against his own people on the ground. Whereas from what we can see from Israel, of course there is displacement, of course there is destruction, but it seems to be acting within proportionate and legitimate aims.
You just hit something, a key term there, Rosa, proportionate, because if we look at Israel's justification at the moment, Mark Regev, who is a spokesperson for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, quotes Article 13 of the amended protocol of the Geneva Convention. He says this, I want to read this. Article 13, it talks about protection of which civilian medical units are entitled to may cease if those areas are used to commit acts of war. So basically, if sufficient warning has been given to evacuate, quote, they may become, under international law, military targets if they are used proportionately. So I think there is the question, isn't it, that analysts, that governments are now looking at, and what the US are urging caution on is proportionality here, when we're talking about potentially more than 10,000 deaths.
Yes, and again, I'd be very careful with the figures because it's very difficult to verify figures. It's very difficult to count the dead, even in peacetime, let alone in wartime when there's been atrocities. But there will be many dead, and many of those dead will be children. But this idea about proportionality, we've seen in other wars, we see it ongoing in the Ukraine war currently, where, for example, a school is turned into a military base, that school can become a legitimate target. The problem in Gaza is that you have two layers. The first layer is the top layer above the ground, which is the civilian layer, and then you have the layer below the ground, the tunnels, which Hamas have proudly shown, which we know about, which show that there are military compounds that are underneath these hospitals and schools. Indeed, there have been rocket launchers that have been shown to come from theme parks and from scout huts and all sorts of other civilian areas that have been turned into sort of military weapon zone. The problem is where you have a hospital and you have people within that hospital, you need to be able to evacuate them to somewhere, which is why the United Arab Emirates and others have been building field hospitals to evacuate those civilians that are either in the hospital or who are sheltering there and sleeping there even if they're not needing the medical facilities, in order for those hospitals to then be dismantled to get to the military underground where the Hamas command centers are. This is deeply complicated as to how this happens, and I'm not a military expert, and I don't think that anyone who doesn't have actual experience of urban armed conflict, which is the most difficult armed conflict in the world, can really understand or talk about the different tactics being deployed. But what we can talk about is about the evacuation of civilians. Yeah. Now, we've seen that since the IDF has been in charge of the two roads that lead out from North Gaza to South Gaza, remember, a very small area of land. Since they've been in charge of them and had 4-hour humanitarian pauses, essentially, to allow civilians to leave, tens of thousands have left, to the extent that Hamas came out yesterday and criticized UNRWA and said that UNRWA shouldn't take these refugees. UNRWA should not be bringing them into the south because they want them to stay in the north as human shields. This makes it even more complicated because just because they're human shields doesn't mean that they're not civilians. No. Does not mean that Israel does not have to do everything they can to protect them. And this is why I don't think any of us can answer whether war crimes have been committed until after the war is finished.
It's a very good point. I think also just to give people a size of planning, if the Israeli government often talk about the size of the strip of Gaza, the main road, about the size of the Edgware Road in London. So a small amount relatively, but given the situation takes hours to actually get out of a conflict zone and clear danger. The other thing I briefly want to get your opinion on as well, because just to explain the complexities of this, it's clear the massacres that happened on October the 7th, I think many would see that as a clear war crime. However, at the moment, Israel is not looking at any future action with the International Criminal Court because they do not see Hamas as a political entity, but as a terrorist group. And those different terms dictate whether or not it's a war crime. Is that right?
Well, yes, and we saw this with ISIS, we see this with Hezbollah, we see this with the Janjaweed, who are currently committing a genocide in Darfur. These are non-state actors, and therefore they're treated differently within international law. But let's also be clear about Israel not looking to the ICC or anywhere else at the moment. Currently, there is another humanitarian crisis that is talked about less and less, which is hostages who need medical aid and need to be released. And their primary focus in Israel at the moment is dismantling Hamas and freeing those hostages, which the Red Cross still haven't visited, or if they have, they still haven't released out any information to the families, even though that is the foundational purpose of the Red Cross. Yeah. And so I think lots of the discussions that we might be having, far away geographically from this situation are not discussions that are being had on the ground, where the sole focus is bringing home babies and children who were abducted more than a month ago.
Rosa, great to talk to you. We will speak to you again in future as this develops, no doubt. Rosa Freedman from the University of Reading.
Thank you.